We're very pleased to have with us today Hank Paulson, who needs no introduction. He was George Bush's Secretary of the Treasury from 2006 to 2009. Not an easy time to hold that position. He was formerly the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and he now runs the Paulson Institute in Chicago. And as a native Chicagoan, he has a very important appointment tonight with the Chicago Cubs, so we're going to try to get him out of here on time. Thank you. So Hank, let me start with the Chinese economy. You were there all the time. You were there last week. Is it turning a corner? Are they making the reforms they need to? And if not, what further reforms are needed?
You know, I always say you can make as big a mistake overestimating China's strength as you can underestimating its potential. And right now, they've got some significant economic issues they're struggling with. Short, intermediate, and long term. I think short term, they're dealing with really high levels of overcapacity in a number of industries like steel and coal. An economy that's slowing, and they're managing currency issues. Intermediate term, they've got debt at the subnational level, and these tens of thousands of inefficient SOEs and municipal debt growing much faster than the economy. That's not sustainable. And of course, longer term, they need a new earnings model. That they're too reliant on exports and government investment in infrastructure and so on. They need more reliance on this, developing a services industry, consumption, higher value-added manufacturing. And so I'd say if there is good news, it is that the answer to all three of these is really accelerating the reforms that Xi Jinping has laid out. And although they've made progress, the most important and difficult ones have been slow in coming. And this is reforming the state-owned enterprises, breaking up the oligopolies, putting them on a level playing field, and making room for the private sector in certain industries like telecom and finance and energy, where the new jobs have got to come from. And you say, why haven't they made as much progress there? There are strong vested interests. And so I think people are going to look and see that the first 5 years of Xi Jinping have been focused on the political issues, on the party. If you're an optimist, you look at the next 5 years as taking on some of these really difficult structural economic issues. And I believe first of all, it's not easy to reboot an $11 trillion economy. Even under the best of circumstances, there's no playbooks, and there's going to be problems. China's size and importance in the global economy means it's going to get a lot of scrutiny. There's going to be volatility. And I think under the best set of circumstances, we're going to see bouts of volatility, fits and starts as this economy gets to a sustainable growth level, which still could be well above the developing world. And so I think I'll leave it at that. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and the key is going to be the ability of this government to deal with the most difficult structural economic issues.
Thank you. Now, there's of course been lots and lots of talk in our presidential election about China.
Right.
And about our own economic imbalance with China. Huge trade deficit. There's a lot of talk about currency, even though that's mostly actually over now.
It's just the opposite. They've been actually propping up their currency when we talk about them manipulating it and driving it down. But anyway, go on.
That's right, exactly. Do you see that imbalance, or trade imbalance for starters, as a big problem? And second, what do you think our levers are? What leverage do we have to correct this?
Well, first of all, I think our trade with China is an enormous benefit to China and to us. You know, trade benefits the United States of America. That China has been our fastest growing export market. It's our second largest export market. We have a trade deficit with China, but with the rest of the world. And that's really more about the United States of America and the fact that we save too little and borrow too much. So, but the levers we have, I think the important lever we have to continue opening up areas of their economy is the bilateral investment trade negotiations which are going on. Because I think the Chinese have traditionally used trade negotiations, investment negotiations, just, the legendary Premier Zhu Rongji used the WTO negotiations to drive reform and opening up in the Chinese economy. But I think it's going to be a real challenge. I think it's these economic linkages, trade and investment, which benefit both of our countries, they're under fire. Protectionism, isolationism, nationalism, and it's going to be difficult to keep that momentum going. But it's going to be very important to do so.
Can I press you a little bit on the bilateral investment treaty? Because we have a group here of business leaders, folks who probably do a lot of work directly with China, people who are experts on foreign affairs. Where do you think it stands, and what specifically would you like to see in it that would be wins for the United States?
Okay, well, let me, because we've probably got people here, that some are experts and some aren't. So the United States is basically an open economy in terms of investment. So that means the presumption is most sectors are open. We have a very small negative list of precluded industries, utilities, defense. And then we have a national security law which limits investment in areas where there's a risk to national security. China is the opposite of that. It's closed unless you negotiate a deal. So the big breakthrough was China had agreed to enter into a negotiation where they were going to define a negative list of industries that were precluded from investment with the rest being open. And so that was a big breakthrough. And so both sides have been working to negotiate a high standards bilateral investment treaty. And the benefit to the Chinese coming out of that would be that this would help drive reform. Because basically, it's going to be a huge benefit to them to have competition and open up certain sectors to competition. And obviously, it helps the U.S. side on their investment. And what I would say is, I wish there had been more progress, but there's been a lot recently. And both sides are negotiating hard. And I think there's some chance, a reasonable chance of reaching agreement this year. But even if they don't reach agreement, the fact that so much progress has been made, I view as a positive. And I think that's about as far as I should go here.
And so you think we might reach agreement before the end of the Obama administration?
Yes, Anja, thank you. I think that this is, it will be easier for the Chinese to negotiate an agreement, I think, with this administration than it will be in the foreseeable future. And I think that should be the goal, to reach an agreement.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So.
And again, this would benefit both countries, because I argue also that the Chinese investment in the U.S. that creates jobs and helps our economy is a good thing. And we've benefited enormously in our economy from foreign direct investment over the years.
That's right. Well, especially in California, there's a lot of Chinese direct investment.
There sure is.
That's right. It's the one growing area, actually, of foreign direct investment in California.
Yeah. And the jobs, when you look at the data, the jobs are actually better paying jobs than the average.
That's right. So let me stay for a minute on trade.
Yeah.
It's a difficult topic. It's been much maligned by both presidential candidates in this election. We're about to go into the lame duck session of Congress, where we might see TPP up for a vote, we might not. Do you think the Chinese, of course, feel a little bit left out of TPP? How do you see, first of all, do you agree that we should pass TPP? How do you see the Chinese reacting to it? And do you think there's any chance that it will be passed?
Okay, wow. So
we're doing complex questions because you have little time.
Sure. So I'm going to begin by saying the trade is an enormous benefit. That there have been studies like the recent Peterson study that show that that the average family in the United States of America has an income $10,000 higher as a result of trade since World War II. But the benefits of trade are spread all over, across the whole economy, and the dislocations are very obvious. And then a lot of the dislocations that people blame, on trade are really the result of technology and automation, which is disrupting all kinds of labor markets or sometimes domestic competition. So I think making the case for trade, and we can talk about how you can do that, I think is going to be enormously important. Now let's get to TPP. TPP that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This deal is really, really important. Think about it for a minute. When we've got 5% of the world's population. The idea that we can sort of draw a ring around the United States and not do business with the other 95% is crazy. If we want to be an economic leader, how can you be an economic leader if when you negotiate a deal with your allies, you can't get it done? And that's, we've had Japan make major concessions, Vietnam willing to change their constitution, Malaysia coming into a rules-based system. So to me, this is a big economic benefit because our markets are already open, already open. The tariffs are lower than anyone else's. So this is a big benefit economically. But if we can't make good on a deal we work out with our allies, this really gets to our economic security, it gets to our national security. So can we get this done during lame duck? I don't know. I don't like to put odds on it. It looks like it's going to be difficult, but it's essential. I just think it's essential. We've got to get it done. Now, how do the Chinese look at TPP? The Chinese aren't part of TPP. It's a very, it's a high standards deal. I think when we get this done, and we better get it done sometime, and when we do get it done, I think the Chinese will aspire to be part of it. And bringing them into a high standards deal, I think, is again very important. I think one of the challenges of the next decade is to continue to bring Chinese into a rules-based global economic system, and they've come a long way, but there's farther to go. And so I see it as very important. And the bilateral investment treaty would mirror the investment chapter of a TPP. So that's part of the way there.
Mm-hmm. So China, of course, isn't standing still in the face of all this. They have their own trade agreement, RCEP, that they're working on. It's a lot farther behind. But strangely, because of the problems that TPP is having in the United States, that has gotten a little bit of wind in its sails. Do you see that going anywhere?
Yeah, I don't. Listen, China is very active doing trade deals all around the world. And to me, trade is good. So God bless them for working to do trade deals. But we need to be a leader. So I'm much less focused. There's so much talk about what China's doing or what they're not. The focus needs to be on our issues and our economy and what we're doing to reform our economy and what we're doing to lead globally. We have to be strong economically, militarily, diplomatically, and one way to be strong economically is to do trade deals that make sense. And the TPP is a high standards trade deal. It sets new standards. It sets new environmental standards. And I'm a environmentalist. Most of my time is spent on conservation and environmental issues. So I go nuts when environmentalists say, we don't like TPP because it doesn't go far enough. And I say, well, what do you think you're going to have if you don't have TPP? You won't have any of this. To me, it's absolutely crazy. So again, this is a high priority, and it's not easy because it's been, there's a lot of concern economically in the United States. There's a lot of disaffected people. Trade is an easy boogeyman, and it is, we saw first Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and they've made the case against trade, and they're wrong, but it's easy to understand. And so I think one of the real challenges we're going to have is how to maintain the momentum behind trade and how to come forward with policies that can be sold to the American people.
The challenge is really how to make globalization great again.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's a great line. I'm going to use that.
Doesn't fit nicely on a hat. No. Let me zoom out a little bit because of course, you see the whole world much beyond China, and you travel a lot. As Treasury Secretary, you were involved with the whole global economy, which was in crisis in late 2008, early 2009. What keeps you up at night now? Are you worried about the global economy? Are you sanguine about it?
Well, my wife, who says I'm snoring 5 minutes after my head hits the pillow, I guess would complain that nothing keeps me awake at night. But what? So I'd say my greatest concern is this: when I look around the global economy, most major economies are really facing structural issues. And that means policies that worked in the past, economic policies, aren't working in the future the way they're not working the way they should. I would say this for Europe, clearly for China, for Japan, and for the US, for Brazil, for most places. And so you've got economic policies aren't working the way they should. The global economy is slowing down. Fundamental structural change is needed. I talked about the structural change that was needed in China. We could talk about, if we had time, what's needed in Europe, what's needed in the US, and so on. But what we're finding is the political systems, whether they're authoritarian political systems in Russia or China, or whether they're the democracies, are having trouble getting the economic policies in place because they're controversial and they're difficult, making structural change. So you see that governments are using monetary policy to try to deal with this. You have negative interest rates in Japan, in Europe, in Switzerland, and Sweden. We have very low interest rates, and so we're debating. We're all caught up in whether our interest rates should be almost zero or a bit more than almost zero, or very small. And so what that says to me is, and debt levels are rising everywhere. So what that says to me is when the economy slows down, we're in new territory, new economic territory, because what policy levers can political leaders and economic leaders pull? You can't lower the interest rate lever, and they've got much less room on fiscal policy. So looking out a year or two, I think we're traveling into some difficult, uncharted water. And the way I look at it, these issues aren't nearly as much economic issues as they are political issues. If you got people around the table and said, what needs to be done economically, you could agree. But it's how do you make the political systems work so that there's going to be some economic success. And of course, when you have economic problems, that then throws a monkey wrench into the political system, as we're seeing a bit during our election, what you saw with the Brexit vote and so on.
Right. Thank you. Let me go to some questions from the audience that actually tie in very nicely to what we've been talking about. And the first question is about, we talked about the global economy. You talked a little bit about the structural reforms we have to make here. Do you think there's a chance, this comes from the audience, that there will be a bipartisan agreement to make the big structural Social Security, Medicare entitlement reforms that we clearly need?
Well, so we clearly need it. And as you know, there's nothing that's easy in Washington. Social Security is analytically simple, but politically complex. And of course, healthcare is analytically and politically complex. And we really need reform in this area, because the longer that we wait, the more costly it's going to be. We'll ultimately are going to need to deal with this mounting debt. Yes, I think the best way likelihood to ever get reform is when you have divided government, because then each side can use the other as an excuse and can negotiate. And if you have a president who wants to work across the aisle, I think that's a hard one to take on right away. I think that the right thing to do is get some momentum and come up with maybe some easier things that can be done on a bipartisan basis, and sort of say, well, now that's one in a row. Now let's do something that's a little more difficult. But it is essential. I mean, if you say, what does our economy need? You all know it. You know, you need tax reform. We have an individual and a corporate tax system that just is a discredit to our society. We need to deal with entitlements reform. We need immigration reform. And these things haven't been done for a reason. It's because they're very, very difficult. But they need to be done. And it takes bipartisan. I've got no use for ideologues. You just need to, it takes compromise.
Thank you. And what do you think? You know all of the players in this drama personally. You know Paul Ryan, you know Hillary Clinton. You came out very famously against Donald Trump this summer. What's your prognosis that we're actually going to get rational centrist government?
Listen, I'm not a political expert. I believe I watched Hillary Clinton when she was in the Senate, and she was pragmatic. She got things done. She could work across the aisle. I watched her do it, so I believe that's her basic. I believe she'll be president, and I believe that's what she'd like to do. Now, how that gets done, because there's real pressures. You know, if it weren't for Donald Trump, the big political story would be what happened to the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders. And so there are real pressures on both sides working against this, but you've got to be an optimist. You need to believe in our system, and I'm very hopeful. I'm a big fan of Paul Ryan, and I know he wants to get things done, and so I would be hopeful. But listen, I'm not into. It's a lot easier to make prescriptions than predictions, and I know what they should do, but I'm not going to make a prediction. I'm just going to say I'm hopeful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time with us, especially on a day when you're so busy. So let's all give Hank Paulson a hand of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.